that giving it a tactility and a kind of curious presence that overcome the purely practical and banal and ordinary way buildings look in China for the most part. Although it's, in some ways, a stocky and massive building like many you would find, it has a very curious character owing to this shape, and the interior also. Okay, here we are in another city, 4 buildings, swapping places, doing different things. This time I'm the science man, the science syndrome. This is really a kind of humorous thing when I think about it now. But this has all happened in a matter of just a few years. But this time, the science building, much larger, this time a 60,000 square foot building. The library was about 25,000 square meters, and the museum was 30. This is 60. So it's becoming a scale which is almost impossible to master, a scale which is impossible to make interesting spaces in. This is the shape of the building. On the lower right, you see it, it's something like a spiral that makes a courtyard, but in it there is another element, which is the planetarium. The planetarium occupying the body of the building, as if orbiting within the mass, is deforming this would-be corner. It's not really a corner, it's on one of the flanks of the courtyard, but is pressing into it as if to determine its shape, becoming a center that is on the edge, because the planetarium needed to be near the perimeter. There are many reasons for this, but it was very interesting to try to deal with it as a peripheral element and something central, and to give it a public presence in the city. But this building is packed with programs of such diversity, and very difficult to maintain interesting communication among those spaces. The standards by which these things are defined are so rigid. This is an opera house, a competition we just won this year. And in this case, we are using 2 surface typologies, which I will show you a little later on. The hyperboloid of revolution and the hyperbolic paraboloid. The hyperbolic paraboloid is the surface geometry we used in Tel Aviv. But here, combining with the hyperboloid of revolution, we're getting a different effect, and one which can make its way around the auditorium in an interesting way, and the concert hall. This dualistic form, which is asymmetrical and eccentric, also was very appropriate to the site, which is very irregular, on the water, a very wonderful site, but shaped very irregularly. I'm going to just go through a few projects. I wanted to shift now, because one of the theme that I touched on earlier, we could be focused on with more attention, was this question of our perception of architecture in real time and space, and how it embodies a distortion in a very palpable way. So I thought I would show a few cases where that is more clear. It's something you can relate to more personally, just to bring it back to the foreground. And that would be just by showing you a house, or a couple of them. It's very different, but I think true to the question. This is like the first house I showed you. You may recall this house that inspired Tel Aviv, but for different reasons caused. This is in a site in California where we must protect the site. There's a tremendous amount of restriction on how the site is to be preserved, and has to, let's say, protect the house from fire, and we have to save trees. We cannot destroy any of those trees you see there. We can't cut into the earth very much. There's a limitation on how much we can cut into the topography. So it had to be parallel to the topography. We had to bend it in the plan to avoid the tree roots, and we had to push it down because there was a maximum height. And the result of doing all of that is a building that's compressed between these 2 surfaces. And again, I resort to this kind of technique of projection to resolve it. The house is embedded in the hill, and as if falling to it, a gable form, a gable which is stretched out and bending with the hill. So it has a kind of figure built into it, according to the idea that it's a house, and at the same time manifest by the site. The most interesting place in the whole house, in my opinion, is here, where the ground rises up into an apex. An apex kind of reaches a point here. You see the same line here, obviously. So it's a parallelogram. Each half of the house is a parallelogram. And we decided to create passage across the space between the two wings. If you look at the main floor, halfway down, like in Tel Aviv, it's halfway. Again, you're entering into the middle of the house. You can cross this way, and some of the earth remains past that point. So the house is literally folding open and grasping the site beyond it. And then what you see is this, the retaining wall and the pathway through. But this is not what we thought it was. In fact, the apex is in the air, and there's space of the house below it. The space of the house tumbles down the hill obliquely in a way, in a cascading form that is not identical to the form of the mass of the exterior. This is not the modernist exterior-interior unified expression. In fact, the exterior and the interior are independent things. This is something like the lightfall form, the exterior, and the interior is coming up against it, confronting it in a very interesting way, and the spaces between become interesting spaces for the house. So you see the envelope of the building is somehow being forced to fall with the site, and the inside is resisting and cascading in a more conventional way. We get something else in between. From the other side, from the uphill, it looks like a completely ordinary building. It almost disappears into the environment of other houses. It doesn't stand out. It's not conspicuous. It's interesting to see architecture have points of intensity and points of, let's say, more conventional vernacular form. This is another house which is, in some ways, vernacular, I think. It's built around a 19th century timber barn, a Dutch barn, a North American Dutch barn. It's overscaled. I mean, what's interesting here is the transformation is about scale, not about shape. The enormity of the house, this is the client, makes for some very strange kinds of experience in the interior. And the windows placed for views and light in different ways, and a space that carves its way through. This house, I think, has to do with the relation between the inside and the outside, transforming that by turning the outside into a pictorial experience. As you know, I was fascinated by that idea in Tel Aviv too, framing views of the galleries in very specific ways. And somehow to have that view framed and capturing views looking back of the barn timber by having the windows be crossed with timber frame was very much in my mind here as well. This is another house where you see how projection distorts the figure of a typical block. And I wanted to show you this, a project which is caught in its site. This is in New York City. It's in an area next to the Ground Zero. You know the site here of the former World Trade Center. Now the new one here is under construction. And this site is here. It's a passageway between buildings. This is it. And because of the way it's bending, it offered a very interesting opportunity for a projectionist to manipulate it geometrically. I wanted to show you this film of the idea, if I can find it. This I think is better as well. I'm having more. Here I am using map to get me to my film. There's no mouse here. My mouse. Okay. Good. need to click on it. Yeah, there. Okay, so there's your bent passageway. And imagine that a typical roof were to be laid down, to be let down, something like a canopy to cover it, but by virtue of running into the building across, it's compressed, it's stretched as it tries to make its way down, and then it is forced to rotate to make its way further out from the building. That vertical line is the bend in the building across the alley. And in folding in this way, it manifests something like it's in the opposite direction. Instead of beginning with a beginning with a parabola, it ends by inferring. Those three triangles manifest implicitly the idea of a parabola. So what you have is this compressed surface and a implicit curvature. So it kind of gives one a different experience. I'm having trouble getting it back on there. Can't get it back. I don't know where it is. So, it's gone. Well, we can pretend it's there. Oh, there it is. Okay. So, anyway, this space is basically a kind of surface that has been caught and compressed and attenuated, so that the length of it, the duration of the experience passing through it, being attenuated, is very interesting. I mean, normally these spaces, these kinds of arcades are subdivided into successive bays. I'm sure some of you have experienced these in Paris, for example. And in Midtown Manhattan, there are a number of those. But this one is smooth and linear, and in many regards, it shortens the experience rather than lengthening it, making it something like a room, even though it's very linear. This becomes a place of gathering, a new type of urban space. It's not air-conditioned, it's not enclosed. It's very successful. It's on the same path as the High Line in Manhattan. Many of you know this new public space, the High Line. This is the idea of bringing the arcade into the vocabulary of public spaces. It's become a very interesting and exciting proposition because of its relationship to public space and its sustainability in regards to the fact that it is not air-conditioned. Now we have another project compressed and very tight, the addition to proposal, I should say, for an addition to a building in Ferrara to house the National Jewish Museum of Italy. I didn't win the competition, but it was exciting to play with this. There's the prison building that was purchased for making a new museum. In the center, sandwiched between two new pieces, and the front one, very interestingly, in torsion, transforming the sequence vertically, the entrance, from the entrance. Office building, back in China, this is much more like the house in California, manipulated by the landscape. I would just point one thing out about it, which is rather funny, I think, which is that if you look at this building, cantilevered in that way, and you recognize that this is cutting through this space, by the time you get here, this is the upside-down version of this. You see, it's almost as if the building has tumbled and turned itself upside down as it's made its way down the hill. But this is not what's really happened. This is just an inference, just an implication. The actuality is an experience of space that connects these and makes public space for all of these office buildings. A kind of sense of community despite the unstable ground, which doesn't allow for any public space. The ground is so topographically deviant as to be impossible to kind of inhabit in a meaningful way, as a group. Okay, the last project I'm going to show you, not that it should be the last, it just happens to be, is another competition for a museum in a city in the South. The reason I'm showing it to you is because I think it does something new with regard to curvature and projection. It's smoother than the other projects that I've been showing you. It is more expressively curved. I'm skeptical of curve, by the way, because I prefer the imagination to complete it rather than to offer it very directly. But these curves are unusual in that they are that combination of paraboloids and hyperboloids. Here you can see how they're connected one to the other through tangency. And in making these surfaces tangent one to the next, we build the curvature, but it's a very disciplined curve. This is not the curve that normally you're seeing with computational architecture, which is a free curve that Zaha Hadid or Gary used. This is a curve that can be developed using very rational panelization, subdivisions that permit a more regular and economical solution to the construction. It's very compelling to bring together that kind of stereotomic principle and curves, in my mind. That's one of the most significant questions of tension in architecture, is how to be free of the limits